I apologize straight away, first, that I'm speaking English to you, but my Russian got very rusty, just like Sylvie's. Perhaps, unlike Sylvie, I should speak also in my third language, French, but je pouvais le faire, mais quand même, I won't do it. I'm going to give you the thoughts of an ancient journalist, an old dinosaur, really. I joined the Financial Times in 1975, so that's rather a long time ago, 40 years now. And I actually became a journalist 5 years earlier. And I learnt my trade out in the provinces of Great Britain, in Newcastle upon Tyne, old coal mining and shipbuilding area. And there I learnt that journalism must be about people. First and foremost, journalism is about people. It must be about what people are interested in. It's a very good rule, even when all looks a bit grim. Remember, journalism is about people. But what I've lived through in these years is the most extraordinary technological transformation that we have seen. I started, after all, as a journalist with a typewriter. I remember saying this once in Galizina, and somebody who came from a very long way away said, "We still use typewriters." But having gone from the typewriter to the telex machine to the fax machine, and then to these tiny little early computers we called Tandies, and then, funnily enough, when I went back to Moscow, when I went to Moscow in 1988, I went back to the telex machine, because our friends from the KGB refused to allow computer signals to be transmitted from Moscow. They had to go by telex so they could read them. What we did was, therefore, we typed on a telex and sent it to Helsinki, where they converted the telex message into a computer message. The wonders of those glorious days of the former Soviet Union. But it was a much slower world when I became a journalist, but sometimes it was a more thoughtful world. You had time to think about what you were doing. The competition was also perhaps less frantic. And the first thing I wanted to say was that this internet revolution that we are living through, I believe, is in every way as big a revolution as the discovery of the printing press in the 15th century. It is an extraordinary liberating technology, but also an amazingly disruptive technology. I mean, just remember what the printing press did. It actually destroyed the monopoly on power of the church. It split the Roman Catholic Church. It liberated ordinary people to read the Bible in their own language. Martin Luther sat down and translated the Bible in an amazing 3 months, I think, into German. It really founded the German language. But also, what resulted from this great schism in the church? It ended up with that devastating 30 Years' War in the 17th century, which laid waste to the whole of Central Europe and actually killed 2/3 of the population of what is today Germany. It was a dramatic upheaval. And I wonder if the internet revolution today could not be every way as dramatic. Let us pray not another 30 Years' War. But what are we seeing in the Middle East today? Probably another 30 Years' War in the Middle East. So the internet is a huge liberation, just like the printing press was. It's allowed ordinary people access to a volume of information that they've never dreamed of before. But it's also very disruptive. And it's that sort of dichotomy between liberation and disruption that I want to look at how it affects us all as journalists today. Because we're overwhelmed with information. We are overwhelming other people with information. And the good old traditional media, whether it's newspapers or radio or television, is rapidly being overtaken by the world of the internet. I was at a meeting at Chatham House yesterday with Carl Bildt, and the discussion was, where do people get the news? And actually, with every passing day, television is weaker, the newspapers are weaker. All my children are getting all their news off the internet. So it is a huge liberation, but it means that there's good information out there and there's bad information out there. Who's going to win the battle? It also means that we, the media, we, the traditional media, are no longer really in control of the information game. Anybody can be in control of it. And not only that, but the computer technology that we have, as you know very well, means that people can falsify information. People can invent pictures that didn't exist. So the capacity for having, if you like, bad information is very big. And let me just pick up on a thought that Sylvie Kaufmann gave you earlier. And my problem with talking to you now is that I agreed with almost everything Sylvie said, and I will tell you a little story about her in a moment. But the building of trust is all the more difficult when people know, is that picture true or is it false? And of course, the brilliance, if you like, of a subject that's been mentioned, and I'm sure throughout the week, of the entire propaganda machine that Vladimir Putin has established, is that he's always able to just raise questions about, well, is it really true? Are you sure? It's not Joseph Goebbels' style of propaganda. It's a much more subtle and dangerous form of propaganda. And our battle to get good information, objective information, true information across is going to be all the more difficult. How do my children, and I happen to have more than I should do, I have 5 children, they get all their information on the internet, they live, my youngest son lives on the internet, his entire life is on the internet, but how does he distinguish between fact and fiction? Because obviously the fiction is often much more fun. And even the popular press, you heard the Daily Mail in Britain mentioned earlier today, probably the most successful commercial newspaper in Britain today is the Daily Mail. And it's brilliant at attracting its readers with pictures of penguins and cuddly teddy bears and things like that. But then it has an agenda that is anti-immigrant, anti-Europe, really quite worrying. It's a very interesting mixture, but a very popular mixture. And this mixture of, if you like, the entertainment, the cuddly, the propaganda, the false, where can we really make sure that we get objective information through in this world? And I think the one other thing that worries me about the internet, and I will sound more like a dinosaur with every passing word, is what I call the blogification of news. And the blog is a wonderful invention, but it is by definition an opinionated invention. It is a way of getting across both fact and opinion all in one article or in one conversation. And the distinction that you were talking about earlier between fact and analysis on the one hand and opinion and comment on the other is becoming blurred in the blogification of the world. So it's a moment when it's not just about the media trying to build trust, but I think the media has enormous responsibility to try and make sure that there is good information out there and that that's what people read. Like Sylvie, I believe that the principles of our profession must be preserved, that the principles I learnt writing on a typewriter are exactly the same as the principles we must maintain on the internet. As Lena said, introducing me, I've spent most of my life as what we call a foreign correspondent. I wanted to travel around the world. I was in Africa, I was in Brussels, I was in Moscow, and I was twice in Germany, in Bonn before, just at the time of unification, and most recently in Berlin. And then after I'd done all that, I did become a commentator, and I was a commentator for 10 years back here in London. I was the foreign editor of the Financial Times, so I was responsible for hiring new correspondents. And I met a lot of wonderful young journalists. In fact, it was probably the most exciting period of my life. Was not reporting, it was finding the next generation to report. But one thing that always worried me was when a young journalist would come in and say, well, I really want to be a commentator. I want to tell people what they should think. And I said, well, I'm sorry, that's not the person I'm looking for. I want a reporter. First, you learn to report. First, you learn to distinguish fact from fiction. Later, you can become a commentator. And I think the worry for me with the internet is that actually, again, that distinction has gone. So if somebody said, I want to be a commentator, I said, sorry, go somewhere else. Go to the Daily Mail. Go and be a politician. But I want a reporter, and that's who I'm talking to. Reporters who are passionate about facts, about accuracy, and about helping people understand what's going on in the world they live in. Because it must be about that relevant world. Writing about processes and theories and everything else is too far above people's heads. Write about people. Not seeking to influence, but seeking to inform. And by giving people good information, perhaps you influence them, but don't start off wanting to do that. Now, I said I learned my trade in the provinces up in the north of England, but more by luck than by judgment, I got to the Financial Times. One of my old friends, does it always work like this, rang up and said, there's a job going, why don't you apply? And I said, I don't want to work for a business newspaper. I want to write about politics and people. And he said, well, there are more foreign correspondents working for the Financial Times than any other newspaper in the world, except for the New York Times. And perhaps it was a golden age that one could be sent abroad to other countries and write about them. And that's what made me passionate. I wanted to use my languages, French and German, and now hopeless Russian. And perhaps it was a golden age, because now some of my colleagues say, why do we need foreign correspondence? We've got the internet. But I believe that that's rubbish. That when you're a journalist, you are both, you've got to understand the story you're reporting, the place you are, the society you live in, even if it's a foreign country. But you equally must understand the people you're writing for. You must understand who your readers or your listeners or your viewers, who they are, so that you can engage them and you know what's going to be interesting for them. So it's a two-way process. Now, it's a fantastic discipline being on a business paper. Maxime was talking earlier, working for Vedomosti business paper, and I'm sorry, Maxime, that the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal have sold out on you. But the discipline of working for a business paper is actually very good. Why? Because business readers don't want opinion, they want facts. Hey, they want to make money, and they certainly don't want to lose money. So actually, it's no good for them being told what they should think about whether Vladimir Putin's a good guy or a bad guy. They want to know whether the Russian economy is going up or going down. And so it was a fantastic discipline to work for, even if I never reported on a stock exchange. Actually, I did. I reported on the launch of the Moscow Stock Exchange. And I'm sure you'll remember, Lena, there was a wonderful story that the late and much lamented Boris Fyodorov used to tell about the day he launched the stock exchange in Moscow when he was finance minister of the Russian Federation. And he drafted the entire legislation for the stock exchange himself because he'd worked at the IMF and he knew what he was doing. And at the last minute, several of his top bureaucrats came into his office and said, Minister, there's a terrible problem with the legislation you have. And he said, why? I drafted it myself. I know exactly what he said. Yes, they said, but you've done nothing to outlaw speculation. Now, the problem is Stock markets are all about speculation. It's the only thing they're really about. Of course, given the bad connotation of the word in Russian, but nonetheless, stock markets are about people betting whether things are going up or going down at the end of the day, which is why I've never made any money on the stock market. Now, I just want to, if you will forgive me, but telling you a little bit about my own story, because all the lessons I've learned in journalism have come through my own experience. And I got to the Financial Times in 1975, and I thought that I would go to places where I could use my languages, France, Germany, or I would go to Asia. That was the exciting frontier. Well, the first job that came up was in Africa. It was in South Africa, because 1976, if you remember, many of you may not have been born, there were the riots in Soweto, and everybody said, oh my God, it's going to be the end of apartheid. This is coming. Well, an awful lot of businessmen had big investments in South Africa, and they needed to know whether they were going to lose their money or not. And so I was sent to South Africa. And before I went to see my editor. Now, he was a brilliant man, a German Jew who'd left Berlin in the 1930s, come to London and made a career as a journalist, ended up as the editor of the Financial Times. But he was a rather shy man, and he always made sure he was sitting on a chair that was higher than the one you were on. So I went in and sort of slumped on the sofa, and he looked down at me and he said, yes, Mr. Peel. I have only two things to say to you. One, the Financial Times is always right, so God help you if you're ever wrong. And secondly, get your hair cut. At that time, I didn't do the second thing, but I tried to do the first. And the question I had to answer going to South Africa was, is apartheid over? Are the investments of all these people in gold mines and diamond mines, are they going to lose their money? And it was an extraordinary period, because learning the lesson about how quickly a regime like that will fall is very difficult to judge. I mean, this was an authoritarian regime with a very passionate ideology that they believed in, and it blinkered them to seeing and understanding the rest of what was going on in their country, the rise of an increasingly middle-class black society who were not content to have no vote. But because it was authoritarian, it was also corrupt. And one of the lessons I learned is that authoritarianism and corruption go hand in hand. In my time, what happened there was an interesting example of when governments get it wrong, when they try and mess with the media. What the South African government did was they decided that they needed to get their message across to English-speaking South Africans and the outside world, because all their newspapers were in Afrikaans, which is effectively Dutch. And so they launched a new newspaper. It was called The Citizen. And it was totally obvious from the word go that it was government propaganda, but it was in English so the world could read it. The trouble was that they had to pretend they weren't behind the newspaper. So they hid the money that financed it in a series of secret accounts. And that was just a bit too tempting for the Minister of Information and his chief bureaucrat. So rather a lot of the money got siphoned off into their personal bank accounts. And it was an enormous scandal. And the whole intention of having this new objective newspaper was destroyed totally by the corruption scandal that blew. But there was something about South Africa which in many ways has a lot of similarities to the Soviet Union, and it taught me some lessons that I needed to learn, a very powerful intelligence service and security service that really interfered. Very strict restrictions on anybody moving anywhere. I was banned as a journalist from visiting any black area. You couldn't move around the country freely. But one thing that South Africa did have, which the Soviet Union didn't, was actually an extraordinary belief in the rule of law. So they had a lot of pretty ghastly laws, but if something didn't comply with the rule of law, it would explode into the public view. And this corruption scandal exploded into the public view because of the courts. Because there were courts there that actually... So afterwards they'd changed the law and it never happened again. But they had this curious but really rather wonderful belief that the law did matter. Perhaps it came from their good Protestant belief in the Bible. Anyway, what happened in South Africa was that I got the story wrong. I thought that apartheid would survive probably for another 50 years, and actually it collapsed in 10 years. And it was a very good lesson to learn, actually, when I came to Moscow. When I came to Moscow in 1988, one of my best friends said, Quentin, it does seem to be awfully confused and confusing, but never forget, empires collapse slowly. And it went a hell of a lot faster than actually any of us imagined. I just want to tell you one other story about my time in Africa, because it involves dear Sylvie Kaufmann. I met Sylvie for the first time when we both went on a trip from London. She worked for the Agence France Presse to Angola, which was in the middle of a pretty ghastly civil war. And we went down in a convoy all the way to southern Angola with a bit of a mistake, but we had no choice, a military escort. So early on one looked like a summer's morning, but it was actually very cold, so we'd all put on a warm coat or something like that. We were bombed on the road by the South African Air Force, which was backing the rebels in the south of Angola against the communist regime in the north of Angola. And we all jumped out of our trucks and scattered into the nearest ditch, and Sylvie and I ended up in the same ditch. And we'd met already, but it was an intimate situation. And especially intimate when we discovered to our horror, after the bombs had all hit the ground, that the ditch we were sitting in was actually the sewage system for the local village. We pulled ourselves out. Being Africa, it was dry. Anyway, what happened out of that story, and it just gives you a nice illustration of the old technology, was that from these bombs that hit the ground, a couple of Angolan soldiers were quite badly wounded, but there was a correspondent from the BBC with us, lovely man, Mike Wooldridge, who actually got hit by a tiny piece of shrapnel coming from one of these missiles. But thank goodness he was wearing a pullover, and the bit of shrapnel got stuck in his pullover and just broke the skin beside his left nipple. Nonetheless, hey, it was a story. BBC man wounded in South African bombing raid. At least that looked like the story. And Mike, who was ever afterwards called Shrapnel Wooldridge, tried desperately to get a telephone line from southern Angola to be able to go on air on the BBC and say, I was wounded, but I survived. Thank goodness we had no way of getting our stories out. But at the end of the day, neither did he. The telephones didn't work. And it took 2 days before we got back to Luanda and were able to actually file our stories out to back to London. 2 days. You can't even think of it. Perhaps you can from some remote part of, I don't know, the far east of Siberia. But even today, I suspect everybody has faster communications. When I was foreign editor, I gave permission for our then Africa correspondent to actually get a satellite phone. I don't know if you remember, they were enormous, great boxes. But suddenly, for the first time, she was able to get online and dictate a story from Zaire, probably in the middle of the Civil War. And about 3 days after she got this for the first time, I rang her up and I said, Michaela, how's the new sat phone? And she said, Quentin, it's better than sex. That was how important it was for us to have good communications. Anyway, after Africa, I went to Brussels and learned a whole different world, not a world of semi-chaos and corruption and poverty, but the world of bureaucracy, the world of the European Union. And it was dealing with an enormous multinational bureaucracy. When I was there were 10 countries in the European Union. Greece had just joined. But it was also hugely political, because every country brought to the table its own domestic politics and its own domestic agenda. And then you had this great negotiation, which even today you could see it again and again, could last for weeks as everybody negotiated how much can I compromise and still persuade my people at home that we've got a good deal. That was part of it. When I arrived, the Chancellor of Germany was Helmut Kohl, the President of France was François Mitterrand, but the real star, the journalists' love match, was Margaret Thatcher. She was the one who everybody wanted to listen to. Now, she wasn't very happy with the European Union. The European Community it was then, but anyway, the European Union. She wanted to get her money back. She thought that Britain was paying far too much money. She was the one person who everybody wanted to listen to. So every time she gave a press conference, they gave her the biggest tent, and everybody turned up, and poor old François Mitterrand was left there with about 4 journalists listening to what he had to say. But in a way, the problem of Brussels was that far too many journalists, and even to this day, went there to report only what was interesting to their own country and missed often the rest of the story. Because really the big picture was, it might be one day what France and Germany were doing and another day a row between Britain and Italy or something like that. There were loads of stories. And given, as you know, the instinct of a bureaucracy is to do things in secret, the wonderful thing about the European Union bureaucracy is there's so many countries involved that nothing is secret. You can always find somebody to tell you what's going on. And I worked out a great way of doing this. The first thing is never believe your own fellow citizens. So the last people I would talk to were the British, because they would always try to use me to spin a story back home. No, I went to the small countries. I went to the Irish, my wife happens to be from Ireland, the Danish, the Dutch. And I got a hint of what was going on. And when I'd got a bit of a picture, I would then go to the big countries and they would deny it. And I'd say, but I know it's happening. And then you'd persuade them that they had to put the story right because you'd got it a bit wrong or whatever. And they would talk. And it was a lesson to me in a different sort of journalism. Journalism like making a jigsaw puzzle. Journalism like finding out bits of information and then trying to work out how they fit together. So you know what it's like when you make a jigsaw puzzle. You've got all this blue, but you can't tell whether it's the blue of the sky or the blue of the sea. And the great lesson for a journalist is you need enough of these bits to fit together to get the big picture. You can never get the whole story from one source, or even from 2 sources. You need multiple sources to double-check and cross-check before you can really get the picture. And it was a great, actually, very exciting time. And one day, my newspaper rings me up and said, the man was going to Moscow, has just dropped out. I tell you, he was our top correspondent in America, 1987. They said, this is the biggest story in the world, we want you to go. And he went off for a year to learn Russian at Harvard. But while he was at Harvard, he met and fell in love with a new lady in his life who happened to be extremely conservative and said, I will never go to Moscow in my life. And so he dropped out, and suddenly they rang me up and said, would you like to leave all that wonderful food in the Brussels restaurants and the story you're so happy with and so on, and go to Moscow, because it's a revolution. And I went home to my wife, and she said, over my dead body. And I took about a month to persuade her. One of the nice things about those times was that actually I talked to 2 or 3 of my fellow journalists who'd been in Moscow, but clearly during the Brezhnev years. But even those who'd been there in those ghastly years of stagnation actually came away saying, it is one of the most wonderful places in the world to work. Partly, yeah. but partly because they would all, when they came away, they would say, "We were in Moscow and we survived." This was what they felt. Anyway, we went. And of course, it was absolutely extraordinary moment in the history of Russia, in the history of the Soviet Union, because there was glasnost, because suddenly the old experts, the people we used to call the great Sovietologists, who knew how to analyze an article in Pravda or Izvestia and look for those weasel words that said, however, after all the boring introduction. Suddenly the story was in the headlines. The story was all over the place. But it's not that glasnost was perfect, as I think Maxim was saying earlier. Glasnost was a very deliberate exercise. It transformed information, but it was a managed process. It transformed information mainly to open up history, to change the narrative. But it didn't really introduce objective journalism. It was journalism, it was information still from top down. The wonderful Alexander Yakovlev, who inspired it, had a very deliberate plan. But as a journalist coming from outside, it was an extraordinary moment nonetheless to be able to report, to be able to go to the Supreme Soviet or the Congress of People's Deputies and talk to everybody. We had a wonderful way too in those years of getting to talk to somebody you'd never met before. It was bring a packet of Marlboro, and you'd meet down in the smoking room, down in the depths of the Kremlin, and anybody who had a packet of Marlboro. I remember interviewing once Leonid Abalkin when he was the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of economic reform, and then an American television crew came up, and they interviewed him in the smoking room, and he was chain smoking cigarettes, lighting one cigarette from another cigarette on American TV. Can you imagine how shocking that was to an American audience who'd all stopped smoking? It was a wonderful world for us. It was a bloody difficult world, I know, for all my Russian friends, including Lena and Yuri and everybody else, because there was no bloody stuff in the shops. It was really difficult, and it was chaotic. So it was very exciting, but very difficult. The stories weren't hidden. They were everywhere. I worked from dawn till dusk. I'd come home at midnight, and then we'd start having dinner or whatever, and then up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and off we went, and writing half the newspaper. My colleagues in other places were so angry because it was Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev everywhere, and if you were in Spain or in Sweden, you just didn't get a word in the paper. But the challenge for us was making it intelligible from this chaotic revolutionary process. It was trying to help people understand where it was going. It was trying to help people understand what made Gorbachev tick, what made this man who was, a perfect product of the whole Communist Party system, somebody who'd been a brilliant operative, who really wanted to save the party. Was he a real Democrat at heart, or was he just going to create a more efficient communist one-party state? I actually think even to this day, we're not entirely sure we know that answer. I got to know quite well Stanislav Chatalin when he was his economic advisor, lovely man. I wrote a piece about him once as the Saint George who may slay the communist dragon. He loved that. He said, "You're the only man who's ever really understood me." But Stanislav Chatalin told me that Mikhail Sergeyevich is at heart a Democrat, but I think he was disappointed in the end. Still, if Gorbachev hadn't been there, if Gorbachev hadn't started that revolutionary process without intending to, I think it would have taken a hell of a lot longer. As it was, it all came apart extraordinarily quickly. And maybe that's the problem to this day. It all came apart too fast. Because what has happened in Russia is that the empire has gone. And learning to live with losing an empire is a very difficult process. I know, because the British have still not learnt the lesson. they still think that somehow they have a global role and a special relationship with India and Africa and China because they're an empire. Well, they're not. But one of the reasons why the British, and I don't know whether you've picked this up while you're here, are so unhappy about their relationship with the rest of Europe is that they feel somehow better, different. And I think that's the problem of Russia today. Russia still hasn't come to terms with the fact that it isn't an empire anymore. It's just a country. I think that Vladimir Putin still wants, above almost everything else, to be sitting at the top table with Barack Obama. All his psychology seems to be predicated on that. And the fact that he doesn't necessarily get invited, or Barack Obama says, talk to Angela Merkel, she's the person you must talk to, is very insulting. It's very insulting to Vladimir Vladimirovich, also because he has great difficulty, I think, taking powerful women seriously. Do you all know the story of the first time they met when she became the German Chancellor? And being a good KGB man, he had done his homework and discovered that there was one thing Angela Merkel was very frightened of, and it was dogs. She'd been bitten by a dog when she was 7 years old. And so the first thing he did at their first meeting was bring his socking great dog, what's it called, Lockie? Yes. Quentin, okay, into the room. Huge thing. Merkel's spokesman told me the story, he sort of confirmed the story to me just a few weeks ago, and he said, no, he said it was even worse than you think. He said, I'm more frightened of dogs than Angela Merkel is. And this dog came up and put its head on my lap while we were eating lunch. And when Angela Merkel flew back to Germany, she was absolutely furious. But she wasn't furious with Vladimir Putin. She was furious with herself because she said it was a classic KGB provocation and I didn't stop him. I recognized it, I knew it, and I didn't say, get that dog out of here. She was really cross with herself. But don't get it wrong, she's never forgotten. Let me, slightly dangerously, because you know this so much better than me, but just touch on, if you like, the challenge of your journalism in Russia. Glasnost was wonderful, but it wasn't about objective journalism. It was more about rewriting history. It was still very opinionated. And indeed, one wasn't always sure that the facts were correct. You tried to double-check them, but it was not clear. And I think the sort of journalism that I believe in passionately, which is the journalism of facts, the journalism of objectivity, still is in so much difficulty. You had perhaps that brief flowering moment of the mid-90s, and then was it all fatally undermined by the whole campaign to get Boris Yeltsin re-elected in 1996, when the so-called liberal media suddenly actually bent all the rules. And so, in a way, was it awfully inevitable when Mr. Putin arrived on the scene and simply reintroduced the whole concept of an utterly managed and controlled media, with, as I was saying, this extraordinarily subtle sense of propaganda. I'm convinced that Vladimir Putin is a temporary phenomenon. The empire is over. The empire's not coming back. But nonetheless, it is a period through which Russia is going to have to go a period of revisionism before perhaps, if you like, is that awful word, a normal country can emerge. And it's going to be a very painful period. It already is a very painful period. The trouble is, I don't think Vladimir Putin has any vision of the Russia that he really wants. He's not a chess player who thinks way ahead. He's a poker player who thinks 2 moves ahead and outsmarts his rivals. I've spent the last 4 years now in Berlin up until last year. Lucky Maxime, lucky Matvey to be in Berlin now. Matvey's must have such a wonderful time because they've got the best kindergartens and the best playgrounds in the world. But you know, writing about Germany is also a big challenge for a journalist, partly because you're dealing with the prejudice of your readers. Even your news desk, you know how important it is to have a good relationship if you're a journalist with whoever's deciding what goes in the paper, on the radio, into the television news program. And even my news editors wanted stories about, oh my God, are the Nazis coming back? Oh my God, is the right wing rising? And I said, I don't think Germany's like that anymore. It's a very complicated country to report about because it's a very federal country, this passionate belief in the devolution of power. It's not a centralized country at all. Angela Merkel says François Hollande and David Cameron think I'm very powerful. I'm not. I spend my entire life having to persuade a coalition government, state prime ministers from all the different states, and then a whole bundle of European Union partners to do the right thing. It takes weeks to get it right. I'm not somebody who can bang the table. But she personifies what the Germans want. She's desperately cautious and rather moral. She's got a very strong moral compass. And that's what I think Vladimir Putin cannot understand. He finds it very difficult to deal with a woman like Angela Merkel, who represents an extraordinarily powerful country, but a powerful country that doesn't want to bang the table. I don't think Vladimir Putin rates the European Union. He thinks it's a ridiculous organization that can never decide anything. I think he's probably delighted that the current refugee crisis seems to be causing so many divisions and strains, which might pull it apart, even if the Euro crisis didn't. And it is, there's no doubt at all, a hugely challenging time for the European Union and for Angela Merkel back in Germany, because her moral compass, which said, we cannot refuse any asylum seeker entrance to our country, has, as you know, brought more than 1 million people into Germany in 2015 alone. But while the media is reporting Angela Merkel under threat, is it all going to fall apart? A very negative story. And you were talking earlier about, do readers want more? They don't want more negative stories. Well, the truth is, to me, the really interesting thing about Germany today is not the backlash. It's actually the extraordinary way in which a majority of that country is prepared to say we'll take in 1 million refugees and integrate them into our society. And that majority is still there. There is a backlash, there's absolutely no doubt, and it could go either way. But behind the negative story is actually an extraordinary positive story. The Willkommenskultur is there. Most German families know what it was to be a refugee. Somebody in their family probably had to pack their bags and leave Poland or Romania or Hungary, or indeed Russia too, and actually go back to Germany. And so there's a real consciousness of what it means to be a refugee that in a country like Britain is really lacking, and the British policy towards the refugees has been absolutely disgusting, not to pull a point on it. I mean, we've taken about 2,000 Syrian refugees, and Germany's taken hundreds of thousands. So I actually think in this case, writing about the whole refugee crisis, there's far too much focus on the numbers and the problems, and too little focus on the degree to which actually it is possible for people to be integrated. Not only that, it's a real economic benefit to a European continent that is slowing down in its demography, it's getting older, it's not going to have enough working people. And if we can integrate new migrants into the society, it will be fantastically good for the whole economy. The danger is that, of course, it's difficult, above all because such a large proportion of the migrants are Muslims, and there's a real clash of cultures between the Muslim culture and the old European Christian culture, even if nobody goes to church anymore. Now, therefore, one of the things I want to underline, and I must wind up. Gosh, I've been talking far too long, I'm sorry. One of the things I want to underline is that I think there are two sorts of journalism today out there on the internet, in the media. One is the easy sort of journalism that tells the readers, the viewers, everybody else what they want to hear. I call it the sort of journalism that panders to prejudice, that tells people, you know, oh, these foreigners are all pretty worrying, we'll have to close the borders and send them home. But there's another sort of journalism that I hope will make people sit up more, will surprise people, will occasionally delight people, tell them what they're not expecting, tell them that it can work. And that's where I think I don't want to lose sight of objectivity for a moment. I want the greatest passion of journalists to be objective and factual and accurate. But I want that passion to be within a model that says never pander to prejudice, never give in to prejudice. The best stories you can ever write are the stories you go out and find that actually make you question your own prejudices, that actually you go and look for a story saying, I think Mr. X is the bad guy and Miss Y is the good person, and actually it's the other way round, or whatever, that actually the real story, those are the stories that are really fun. And you come back and say, it wasn't anything like I expected, it was completely different. They're the best stories to write. I think I better wind up, because I've talked for far too long. But what I want to leave with you is this. We journalists have got to be very stubborn and very brave. Everything I've said probably reflects a world to you that is just so bloody easy compared to the world you're living in and you're struggling in. The debates you've just had about all the problems. You know, is there investigative journalism? And as Michael Fishman said, I'm not sure there is any longer, or very little, because it's so dangerous. We've got to be very brave, but we've also got to be quite humble. We do get things wrong. We have a fantastic influence, potentially, through the internet and so on. If we make mistakes, we've got to admit we make mistakes. We may make matters worse. I agree with Sylvie when she talks about the way that the media has undermined the political process, the democratic process, by actually raising up politicians and then destroying them, by writing about their sex scandals which are irrelevant to their politics. All that sort of stuff, I think, is a great pity. But for all our faults, the battle for an independent, objective media is absolutely critical. I think more critical today than ever before. It's the communication and information is now the lifeblood of any society, the lifeblood of power. And exploiting that, or countering the exploitation, is vital. I think that if we allow the propaganda to win, we'll slip back into total dictatorship. I'm convinced that in the end, the liberalizing side of the internet is more positive than the negative side. But we've got to watch out. The world was transformed by the printing press. It was a reality that would never go away. The world will be transformed by the internet. It's a reality that won't go away. But it will be very uncomfortable, and we're the ones who've got to be responsible for making sure it's a good thing and not a bad thing. I'll leave it like that.